Greetings from the Grand Canyon. It is sundown here. Perfect time for me to sit at the table and do a video, as I promised on podcast 1116, which I called Sharecropper Nation. So I'm going to have a little coffee. Actually, I'm not ready to do that yet. I got to put some more hot water in there from the famous jet boil. Then it'll be ready in a few minutes. And of course, I want to thank the most recent, something like, 200 or so subscribers for getting me close. I think I'm almost to 1,700, which amazes me. And I really appreciate people subscribing. Thank you, Travis, in Oregon or wherever you are. Washington, I think you're in Washington. Thank you, Electric Fish. Thank you, Mike Murphy, and somebody else. I forgot who, but I'll remember. Brandon Sabata, thanks. He is definitely a YouTube subscriber, and really appreciate his contribution to the Bob Davis podcast just recently. So thanks. Been at the Grand Canyon for, at the end of the day, it's probably going to be almost a week. Certainly been in the area for almost a week. I have a little bit of a mechanical issue, which I explain in the podcast. And I'll put a link up to the podcast so you can find the audio podcast. What I do with the videos, if you don't know, is I'm not really big on video production. So, as I talked about in the last podcast, these podcasts are pretty static, just static camera, no real lighting, no massive editing and B-roll and all that kind of television talk going on here. The intention is to give you an idea of what the content is in the audio podcast. But since this is a process, there's always more to say, and it doesn't matter how many times you do a podcast, you're going to find that you have more to say, and you can't help yourself. So it's great to do videos, little video clips, or longer form videos. And the reason I'm doing a longer form video here is there's no way I could have gotten all the information in a short that is involved with this podcast that I just did, podcast 1116, Sharecropper Nation. I get confused between the podcast number and the number of subscribers. Where do I start? I find that travel is extremely educational. And this has been ever since I did travel with my family when I was a kid. We'd drive down to Florida every year. Those are some of the best memories that I've ever had. And in addition to that, I learned things that I didn't know that I even knew. The interesting thing about travel is it gives you perspective. You hear people say things about individual states. Usually in the political milieu, they'll say things about various states this and various states that. And if I've learned anything traveling, it is that various states of the United States, which is the focus of my travel, have really varied histories, and they are very different. We are constantly hit with this United States, North America thing, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not necessarily negatively judging that, but individual states have individual histories. They were settled at different times. They all have very interesting calamities that happened, if you will. Things that tornadoes, floods, people, massive movements of people, war, all sorts of things in these states. And it's hard to believe, even though we have a relatively short history in North America, especially when you start talking about the American West or the Plains. Even the Midwest is relatively recent in terms of history. So if you say, if it was 1950, it would have just been 100 years ago that we were just beginning to enter the Civil War period in the United States. So if you go fast forward to 2023, it's a little bit longer. But if you want to do it in 100-year demarcations, it's pretty amazing that that stuff happened in historical terms relatively recently. So I'm sorry about the wind. The wind comes and goes out here. It's been raining, so it's up and down when it comes to the wind, and you're 7,000 feet up. So the things that happened that people have forgotten in many cases are actually pretty significant in the history of this country, and the history of human beings. In many cases, we don't think about them, but they happened just in historical terms yesterday. So I had quite an experience in Oklahoma because I traveled the short panhandle of Oklahoma to the west. And this is where the sharecroppers were put off their land through various reasons in the 1930s, late 20s, early 30s through 1939, and this became this great movement west of these sharecroppers from all over the United States who had migrated there since the relatively late 1800s to have a pretty good life sharecropping. Sharecropping is just simply tenant farming. You become a tenant, you farm a plot of land, and the rent is a third of your produce and a half of your other earnings, and that's your rent. And this was implemented in the 1860s after the Civil War in the South as a way of providing employment for the freedmen, that is to say the former slaves in the South. And many tenant farmers, sharecroppers, there really aren't any anymore because sharecropping died out after this story I'm going to tell you. Many of them were black, but many of them, surprisingly, in terms of what you would expect from history, were white. And many of the sharecroppers in Oklahoma were white, although I have since learned there were black sharecroppers in Oklahoma, and they were part of this movement west as well. What am I talking about? In the podcast, I'm talking about The Grapes of Wrath and John Steinbeck and this masterpiece, which he wrote. He wrote two versions of it, one of which he destroyed because he felt that it was too judgmental and too harsh, and then rewrote the book that has come down to us. I talked to a park ranger today here who didn't know anything about this whole experience in Oklahoma of these people, didn't know anything about what sharecropping was or any of that. And I'm interested to hear her perception of the podcast when she hears it, if she hears it. I entitled it Sharecropper Nation, because I have done 4 or 5 or 6 podcasts about economics in the last year. I wouldn't say predicting a recession. I would say wondering if we're going to have one, and talking about the metrics, and they get kind of technical. And they're based on my own studies and the people that I watch and the ideas that I come up with from the numbers, raw numbers that I see. The last one I did at the beginning of the summer, June or July, and that one is probably the most recent one, because that's the one with the most recent data, and that's linked in the Bob Davis Podcast blog. And then that particular blog for that particular podcast also has all of the links to all of those sources so that you can find out what the M2 is. You can find out what unemployment was, or it should be current when I did it. It should be current when you hit the site if you're particularly interested. I didn't want to do another podcast about economics that was extremely detailed, and because I think that turns people off. My interest in economics has really goes back a long way, but there's a lot that I've learned that I didn't know then, and there's a lot that I don't know now. And my study of economics really has to do with the price of fuel, which has gone up and is now moving down slightly. We'll see what happens next week. I'm not doing a podcast about the price of diesel fuel, but that was my primary interest in the studies that I was doing, because I wanted to find out, I wanted to sort of get a handle on what a recession would do with the price of fuel. And for nomads, that's our biggest price input is fuel. We pay for gas, and when it's expensive, we don't get to travel as much, and when it's cheap, we love it because we can run, and that's what we want to do. Where was I? So I did this podcast about economic issues because I felt that it was time to do it. And this one is called Sharecropper Nation because what I did was I went through and I detailed the average income for most Americans and the average expenses for most Americans and the hardship that most average Americans and above average Americans, not just average, but slightly above average Americans, are dealing with right now. And the extent to which, when I got through with that, I decided, we're kind of sharecroppers because we don't own the means of production. We're working for somebody, we're renting, or we've borrowed several hundred thousands of dollars in most cases to buy a house which we don't own, the bank owns. And if we don't have big savings and if we don't have two incomes, we're this far from being thrown out of our house. And to me, that is the definition of sharecropping, which is that you're a tenant farmer and you're subject to the whims of your landlord, who happens to be the farmland owner the farm that you're actually farming. Now in the South, what ended up happening with sharecropping was that it essentially reinstituted the old plantation system, especially when you consider the establishment of Jim Crow laws, etc. In the South. You just basically, at the end of the Civil War period, 60, 70 years after the Civil War, the plantation system and all of the, if you will, race laws were essentially reenacted. And so sharecropping gets a real bad name, and it's also unfortunate because you do a lot of work and you don't own. Now, many of the sharecroppers in Oklahoma ended up buying farms, but in the Depression, which deflation caused the price to go down for all the food that these farmers were, growing. They couldn't get the price, and therefore they couldn't pay their mortgages, or they couldn't pay the landlord. And so thousands of people were put off the land, and they went west on Highway 66. Their target was Barstow, California, where their ambition was to become migrant farmers. Unfortunately, they were, confronted with Latin American migrant workers and American migrant workers, California migrant workers, who didn't particularly want Oklahomans in California running the price down for migrant labor. So this is the basis of the Grapes of Wrath. It's interesting. I just very quickly going to point out, because this is the amazing thing about Americans is I asked somebody, whatever happened to the Okies who went west, who were in Steinbeck's book, that sort of the Joad family, which was his creation, a creative synthesis of the many families that he met and talked to in his research for the book. Whatever happened to them? Well, the truth is that many of them ended up doing very well. Many of those families and the people that went to Barstow, especially Barstow, is very much Oklahoma today. Oklahoma type churches, Oklahoma type family values, Oklahoma. They ended up becoming a really important central part of that part of the country. So it's amazing because they ended up persevering and prevailing after this horrible experience. So this isn't really a dark passage, but the details are simple. The average family in the United States earns $56,000 a year. If you are a two-income family, so if you have a wife and she has a $56,000 a year job and you have a $56,000 a year job, you're at roughly $112,000 a year, which is, you would think, a lot of money. Then I looked up the average expenses for most Americans, and when you get into the average expenses, starting with transportation, heating, entertainment, and all these things, which are anywhere between $800 and $200 or $300 a month, when you consider the fact that it costs something like $17,000 a year to raise a child, And if you have two or three, well, now you know already without me telling you that at the end of the month, there's more month than there is money left. On top of that, rents are at $2,000 a month in most places, and the average price of a home is $418,000. And if you wanted to buy one at 7.75%, you'd end up paying close to $800,000 for that house at $418,000. That's ridiculous. And one wonders how people can afford $418,000 houses, $100,000 cars, and so on. So I did that because this is potentially a huge social time bomb. And little elements of it we are starting to experience. And I want people to listen to the podcast because I want them to hear the whole, enchilada in terms of the details. But it explains a lot of the issues that we're having, because how do you handle that? Well, you go to the credit cards, and you go to the beer and the nuts and the weed, and you just hope that you can muscle through. If we have an economic downturn, there are going to be a lot of people that are put out of their houses, and it's not going to be a pleasant experience for large numbers of people. We're drowning in debt in this country, not just individual, but corporations, and of course we all know the stories about government debt. And I'm not going to go into that on this, because the intention here wasn't necessarily to get political. It was to put a capstone on the economic stuff. I'm going to put my cup in front of the microphone, so hopefully it doesn't blow into the microphone. But that puts a capstone on all of the other economic podcasts that I did. It also illustrates, if you take the time to investigate what you can learn when you're traveling, because there's no signs up along the road really in Oklahoma. They don't particularly want to talk about it, because every time you look up sharecropping and Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, you get the Dust Bowl. Well, the Dust Bowl is not what caused their departure from the plains in the Oklahoma Panhandle. The Dust Bowl took place down in Texas, which is a couple hundred miles south. What happened in Oklahoma was purely economic. They moved there in the 1880s. They had, several generations, and life was good. Those people made good money. They were farming wheat, which you cannot plant in that very light, thin soil in Oklahoma. It's not like North Dakota, which is a rich black loam, or Minnesota or Wisconsin. These Midwest areas have this very rich in nutrients soil. And they don't have that in Oklahoma. Oklahoma, if you just drive along, you can look and you can see how dusty it is, and you can see how thin that dirt is. The other thing is that in that area, it goes through wet cycles and dry cycles. So if you're farming and you're not prepared for that, then if you're farming wheat, what it did was it denuded the soil, and over time it destroyed the ability to grow anything, because the prairie grass grows. Now, if you take your shoes off, mine are on actually right now. Usually they're off, but if you take your shoes off out there and walk in that prairie grass, it's really it's hard to walk in bare feet in the prairie grass. It's not soft, inviting, warm grass like in the Midwest. It's very thick, and it goes way down deep. It rips down into the soil, and it's thick grass. And at the time that people first started going out there, when the Native Americans ruled the plains, those prairies were, that grass was as high as the man's head, 5, 8, 9, 6 feet, depending on where you were. And then the farms came, the settlers came, and they took all that down, and they fenced it off, and you can graze cattle, you can grow cotton. But growing wheat and the kinds of crops you would grow in Tennessee or Kentucky or Illinois, Indiana, you don't grow in Oklahoma. So that's what I did, and I thought that was a great idea. I think it was an eye-opener to see, and I kind of knew, but it was an eye-opener to see. And if you want to see it, Walmart now has an entire section in most Walmarts, which is bread, jams, jellies and jams, peanut butter. And when you look in the carts of the people at Walmart, more often than not, you see a lot of staples. You see bread and peanut butter and jelly, and maybe you see some chicken. But people are eating peanut butter and jelly, and we haven't even gotten to the point where there's a downturn. Now, if you listen to this video and you live in New York City, or you live in Chicago, or you live in Seattle, and you have one of those, cool tech jobs, or you work in media, or you work in finance, you're like, what are these people talking about? Because you're making $150, $175, or $200,000 a year, and you're married, and your wife makes 100 or more. She makes more than you do because you both have elite, college degrees. I'm talking about people who are basically $28 an hour people. This is what I mean by Sharecropper America. And what is it? How big is it? Well, we're talking about 85 million people who are not in the investor class. We're talking about 85 million people who don't, day trade, who aren't running hedge funds. We're talking about 80 million people who aren't making $250,000 a year because they have a doctorate from Princeton, or $300 or $400 or $500,000 a year because they're a cancer doctor. And those are important positions, but there's a whole lot more people out there that are living hand to mouth and using credit to get by after they spent all their savings. So I do these podcasts every now and then to just point it out. It isn't every day that I come up with this stuff while I'm traveling, but I had, I just had the feeling I had to do this. So again, thanks for the subscriptions. Check out the podcast at thebobdavispodcast.com. I'll put a link in the description box for the podcast, and I'm going to finish my coffee. I got to get the fire going because it's kind of cool tonight. Bye-bye.